Well, hello everybody, and at face value, the COVID-19 pandemic is posing what some would say is an existential risk or a threat to the global airline industry, because we've got an unprecedented public health emergency colliding with a debilitating recession. And given continued uncertainty as to how this crisis will get resolved, it's hard to see how airlines can plot a safe and commercially viable flight path to return to cruise altitude. Even the most optimistic prognosis doesn't seem to see a return to 2019 business conditions until at least 2023, and some would say that might not come till 2025. Well, joining me today is a gentleman called Bryan Del Monte. He's president of the Aviation Agency, and that's a company specializing in marketing for the aviation sector. Bryan also has a background, interesting background in the U.S. Department of Defense. So I guess he has some idea what makes the government tick as well. So, Bryan, thanks for joining us to talk through this dreadful predicament the airlines find themselves in fact, the whole aviation sector. In your view, what's the best path to recovery for this sector? I mean, assuming they have any sort of control at all, and you know, what really can they do to try and pull themselves out of this?
Well, I don't know that there's a best path. First of all, thanks for having me. I don't get to talk politics and policy all that much anymore as an ad guy, so it's good to talk about this. I don't know that there's a best path for the airlines. There are lots of really crappy paths. Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be the most difficult time, especially for U.S. airlines, since deregulation. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that you can have a full recovery of commercial scheduled service until there's a resolution of the public health crisis.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult for me to see how the airlines individually or collectively can do anything on that problem, right? That is that is a governmental level problem. It's a public health issue. And, you know, there are things that they can do, but really airline travel will not restore until people feel 100% comfortable that getting on a plane may not kill them. Yeah. And that resolves, and that is a consequence of solving the public health crisis, specifically with coronavirus.
That's interesting. So to your mind, a lot of it does have to do with resolving the public health crisis and indeed consumer confidence tied to that. In other words, it's not just about what governments allow or don't allow. It's about whether people will even get on those planes if they are permitted to do so.
That's right.
And that's an interesting point. Nonetheless, at the moment, we do see, you know, what I describe it as a sort of complex array of travel bans all around the world, travel bans, travel restrictions, threats of quarantines, heaven knows what. And I can barely make sense of them. You know, they seem to potentially change all the time. Do you think that those won't get sort of fully lifted until there is a clear path to resolving the public health crisis? And isn't the danger there that nobody's totally certain what resolving that crisis really looks like? Does it mean just, well, things are getting better and soon we'll have a vaccine, so we're fine? Or do you literally have to wait until there is a vaccine and then things are fine?
Well, let me just first separate. I think there's a difference between what we should do and what's going to happen. Okay. Ideally, if, you know, you're doing this as a tabletop paper exercise, you limit the amount of travel, economic activity, social activity to snuff out the virus, right? Okay. But that's not what's going to happen for a whole host of political reasons. There's blowback from people, there's blowback from governments, there's blowback from leaders, you know. So what's the situation look like right now? Today, right now, most people can travel within their own country, but country to country travel is effectively impossible. Okay. So the question is going to be, when are we going to allow international travel? Although we already have it for goods and products. Okay. I think there'll need to be either a consensus formally reached or informally reached that collectively the countries that are going to interact with one another believe they have sufficient capability to mitigate the health effects that they feel confident enough working with one another and allowing each other's nationals to come and go. Mm-hmm. I don't know when that day is, but I'm not thinking it's the end of June.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know how well airlines can do on, if you will, domestic only activity, right? I mean, most of their money, to the extent they make money in the actual transportation of people, they make that money in the long haul. So, I think the solution comes when everyone feels, okay, look, the situation's not great, but we can mitigate the risk. Okay. Would a vaccine be helpful? Absolutely. Would effective therapeutics be helpful? Absolutely. Do I think we're going to wait for either of those before we restore international air travel? No, because I don't have a lot of faith that that institutions will prioritize the public health risk unless there's another explosion. And they're under so much political pressure. Open, 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 open. We're dying economically here. Open, open, open. Well, until, there's this calculus. How big does the butcher's bill have to get before people are more afraid of their constituents dying than yelling at them?
Yeah, good point. Right. Well, that's interesting. Now, we talked about travel bans. Now, at the same time, there's a lot of chatter going on about the sort of restrictions and requirements that might be put on airlines for them to resume, particularly international flying. I'm thinking like things like reduced load factors because, they're told that they can't fill the middle seats in a 3-seat row, and, requirements for passengers and crew to have masks and for social distancing in airports. Let's just assume for a minute those are sensible measures that are worth taking. Do you think enough is being done to engage with the industry in terms of how these things can be achieved and whether you can even have commercially viable operations if you do those things? Because I see a lot of airline lobbyists just kind of shrugging their shoulders saying, well, yeah, we hear this thing's coming, but we don't really know what it is. Nobody talks to us, It just seems very unsatisfactory in a way.
Well, okay, so let's first, we can't just assume that these things are useful. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I'm going to say that and want to talk a little bit about it first is because it's where the engagement point needs to happen. Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of a single airline that could function and make its payroll and make its debt obligations on a 66% load factor. Mm-hmm. If that were indeed true, we wouldn't have needed to bail them out. Yeah. So let's say you want the airlines to do all that. Okay. You can't just yell at your black and white TV for not coming in color. Okay. So you can't just yell at the airlines and say, you can't let anybody have a middle seat, because they're going to be like, well, how are we supposed to pay for fuel and payroll and the planes and everything else then? So if you really want the airlines to do this, and there may be a public health benefit to doing this. Again, it's that whole, there's never, look, in politics, there's never a hot fudge sundae versus, mud sandwich choice. It's always mud sandwich. The question is, how much dirt do you want to eat? Right. So on this, it's like, OK, airlines, we want you to fly 66% load factors. And to achieve that, we're going to subsidize you. Absent federal policies doing that, I don't see a single airline that could fly on 2/3 revenue and survive. Yeah. Okay. So if you want them to do that, then you got to cover the gap for them. Because, yeah, they can go out and raise money and they can do that. But, loans got to be repaid. It's not magic money that just falls out of the sky. So eventually their debt loads will get so high, they'll just implode. Mm-hmm. Right. So unless the federal governments are going to subsidize this new normal of everyone sits every other seat and everyone's sealed in a bubble and they all get sprayed down with Windex or whatever before they get on board. Right. I mean, and here's the thing. It's going to get odious as hell to travel. Yeah. I mean, think about how bent out of shape people were to take off their belts and their shoes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now we're talking about blood tests, which I've come out and been very against. I don't think the airline should be in that business. If governments want to do it, fine. But, but even so, people aren't going to submit to all this nonsense, right? So there's this friction point. They got to find that sweet spot. And, if the airlines want to work with the government, I don't think the airlines need to just sit there passively. Okay, if we said, look, we'll restore international air service, but we're going to need a subsidy that scales down based on revenues and ticket passaging, and the public health risk, then you'll get that solution, right? Where you want people with masks and every other seat and everything else. Otherwise, the airlines, they just can't do it, and they're not legally required to do it. Consumer confidence, is the problem. Mm-hmm. It's the problem economically. It's the problem in commerce transactions. It's the problem with constituents and their governments right now. There's not a lot of confidence in their institutional behavior.
We talk about consumer reactions. One reaction to this situation that springs into my head, and some people in private and business aviation are hoping for this reaction, and that is that those people who could afford first-class airline seats start to think, you know what? The charter rates on that Learjet 60 don't look so bad now. If I get my family together or 4 or 5 of my buddies, suddenly that looks a bit more affordable than I thought it was 6 months ago. Could you see that this being kind of an opportunity, at least in part, for private aviation?
Well, not to toot my own horn and not to toot my company's horn, but we're betting our future on it.
Interesting.
We think business aviation this is going to be their renaissance for exactly the reason that you've specified. Look, I love this industry. I love aviation. I believe aviation is the underpinning of modern society. I do not believe the 121 carriers are coming back for a decade. That's my belief. Okay? I hope I'm wrong. But I don't think I am. Okay? At least not today. I think we will see people leave the market despite the bailouts. I think we will see a long-term consolidation of capacity. Why do I believe these things? Because I sit in on these meetings too for the AFA and the rest. And if they really felt that this was a short-term measure, why are they getting rid of aircraft? Why are they permanently parking in the boneyard? I mean, look, they know the handwriting on the wall too. They're settling in for the long haul. So this moment, when there aren't 30 flights to Topeka in first class anymore, how are you going to get there on your terms? I do think business travelers, businesses are going to look heavily at the 135 operations as a stopgap. I think you're going to see a lot of businesses invest and have Part 91 fleets of some kind, whether it's King Airs or, medium-sized turbine or things like that, right? And they're going to evaluate their own travel and figure out, okay, what do we really need, right? Because here's the thing, if you're spending, $100, $200, $300, $400,000 a year on travel, you're now spending enough that, let me tell you, there are a lot of charter companies be more than happy to put together a jet card for you. Okay.
Yes, true.
And there isn't going to be the coronavirus risk, and you get to run on your own terms, and the planes are fully taken care of, and, so I do think, look, in every economic shift, there are winners and losers. The losers, I think, are going to be the 121s because they're saddled with debt, they're saddled with overhead, they're saddled with the schedules and everything. And the winners are going to be the manufacturers of small and medium turbine, of medium turboprop. Those are going to be the new planes that new Part 91s set up, in businesses that are 200 million or more. You're going to see a lot of agencies, professional agencies, law firms, ad agencies, accounting firms, things like that. Instead of putting their guys on first class, they're going to send fewer guys on charter. Right. But it's going to be on their terms. And it's actually probably going to be a savings because now they don't need to stay overnight. Get your business done. Get back on the jet.
Good point.
Right.
Yeah.
So for me, honestly, not to be like overly excited and cheerleading for this, I think 135s and the manufacturers of turbines. And I also think the secondary market, when things start to ease up, it's going to be raining money for them if they go out and get it. The case can be made. The airlines have never been weaker than they are now. And so charters and biz jet makers, they can go out there and make deals to, because business still has to get done.
So on that note, obviously your expertise is marketing and advertising. Do you think the air transport industry as a whole, and I would include airlines and charter operators too, are facing a sort of marketing challenge going forward in terms of convincing people that their way of moving them around is going to be safe and viable for them? Is the industry going to have to somewhat reinvent itself in terms of how it repackages itself?
It's going to need to reinvent itself, and it's going to do something that most of this industry isn't accustomed to doing, which is actually routinely marketing and advertising. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. The airlines, if I were to look, as a marketing guy, if I were to look, and I did, if I were to look at this industry, on the top, you've got the airlines that are spending money. Not as much as they used to, but they, you saw them on TV, you saw them in print, they talked about new trips to Asia, new trips to Germany, right? And they were creating demand. And you will see that pick up again because they're not idiots. They know in depressions and recessions, they have to advertise heavily in order to create demand. Okay. But everybody else below that level, how'd they get business? Word of mouth, referrals, trade shows, right? Very light advertising by and large, right? They didn't get it. So now they have to create demand. If I'm a charter company, I have to tell people in advertising and accounting and lawyers and doctors, hey, I exist. This option exists. Okay. And so I have to now advertise in vehicles I wouldn't normally think about. And I have to convince them this is safe. This is economically feasible. This can be integrated into your activities. And so they have to go out and they have to create markets. And this is not something this industry does.
Well, that's fascinating, Bryan. Really, you spelled it out very clearly there, and I appreciate you being so candid. It'll be interesting to see, how long-standing these changes are. Whether this truly is going to shake up the industry, or whether we'll be back here in 12 months going, geez, can you believe we made such a fuss? Here we are. It's just back to how things were. But I suspect it won't be.
If that's the case, I'll happily come back on and say I was wrong to your viewers.
Right.
I don't think we're going to have that conversation.
No, I fear not. I suspect not.
I'll eat crow on that if that's how it goes.
Good stuff. Bryan, thanks for your time. It's great to get your perspective on this extraordinary situation, and we would like to catch up with you again in the future if we may.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me, Charles.
Thanks for watching this AIN video. Please like, subscribe, and share it if you've enjoyed it. Also, visit AINonline.com for all the latest on the aviation industry.